Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And before we go further, I just wanted to say, I don't know, it's so lovely seeing you all the time. We are going to be heading to Atlanta on Wednesday. I hope to have a lesson on Wednesday. I'm not sure about Thursday or Friday. We'll just have to see how things work out, and I will let you know. The other piece is that apropos of sort of meeting every day, just what a wonderful way it is to start the day. And I cannot tell you how many times when I've sort of gotten up and maybe felt a little bit depressed and then gotten involved in Torah study, and somehow my heart is lifted and the depression is gone. And I don't know if you're at that point yet, but I hope you do get to that point of feeling that there is something so incredibly worthwhile about this. And that sort of includes the moments when it's very challenging. It might be challenging conceptually. It may be challenging in terms of cross values and things like that. But I have to say that it is one of the greatest things we have, and that the statements that we have about it being a tree of life and those sorts of things, they're not just facile comments. They're actually deep reflections on how worthwhile this is. Having said that, we will go into the text. Kevin, good to see you again. I'm so glad you're back.
Kevin. Good morning.
And here we are. So we are now we've just had this beautiful, beautiful section about loving your neighbor as yourself. And now we're going into something a little bit different, right? Et chukotai tishmoru, you shall guard, right? You shall guard my statutes. And here we go. Behem techa lo tarbiu. And now we're going to have some examples. Your cattle you shall not crossbreed. Kilayim. So this word kilayim, if we look at Onkelos, he says, interestingly, a word that you're familiar with, which is eruvin. You've heard of the eruv. And like the word erev, right, which means evening. And it comes from a basic meaning of mixture, blends. And so kilayim, Onkelos says, essentially means, crossbreeding, mixing species. So an arbitrary law, right? Sadcha lo tizra kilayim, not only with cattle, but it ups the ante a little bit, and it says, your field you shall not sow in kilayim, right? Again, chak lecha, your field, you shall lo tizra, you shall not sow it, eruvin. So Onkelos is very helpful here in terms of taking an Aramaic word, which is linked to a Hebrew word, and translating a difficult Hebrew word here as to what it means. We haven't finished the verse. We're going to go a little further. So upping the ante even more, uveged kilayim, and clothing of blended mixtures, right? And he goes on to say shatnez. Now this word shatnez looks like it has five different consonants. And you know that Hebrew words generally come from triliteral roots. This doesn't sound like a Hebrew word at all. And the way this is dealt with, we'll see in Rashi. Lo ya'aleh alecha, it shall not go upon you. You shall not, it literally means, it shall not go up upon you, such clothing. So this is the idea, as Rashi's going to tell us, about chukim. Chukim are, well, I'll let Rashi speak. Let me do that. So go back to here, right. Et chukotai tishmoru. He says, ve'elu hein, and he says, and these are them, right? Behem techa lo tarbia, kilayim, ve'gomer, etc. He says generally, so right, your cattle you shall not crossbreed. Chukim, statutes. Elu, when he talks about chukim, elu gzerot, these are edicts melech, these are sovereign edicts, she'ein tam ledavar, which doesn't seem to have a reason for them. In other words, they seem to be arbitrary edicts. And I'm going to comment a little bit about that because it's obviously, this really goes deeply into our ain't no one going to tell me what to do kind of thing, right? So clearly observing this demands a level of trust in the divine ability, in us being submissive to God and in our accepting divine commandment. So let me comment on that before we go on to the explaining these particular specifics. I believe that the chukim, and by the way, we could include kashrut in that, we could include Shabbat, but certainly kashrut, we could explain in that regard that it's a chok, it's an arbitrary law. But here's the point. The point is that these are, even though I haven't read it anywhere, I believe that these chukim are there to allow us to express sincere love of God. That when we observe chukim, which don't have any other reason behind them except that God commanded them, that's a good enough reason, right? That because I said so, that it shows a level of love, of true love. And I think that applies also between human beings. That when you really deeply, sincerely love someone else, first of all, of course, it requires the trust that I mentioned. You can't really have love unless you trust that person. But the other way is that it's a way of expressing it. So the truth is that they're also potentially a way for us to feel joy, because I think that one of the greatest joys we can feel is to be able to express our love for the person we love and to know that that love is appreciated. But regardless, it is a reason for us to feel a sense of happiness in our lives. So, I know that these tend, of course, for the very reason that they're not rational, they tend to be laws that are ignored or belittled or whatever. And yet my sense is they're some of the profoundest laws, or the most profound laws that exist for us, because they are there to give us the possibility of performing the commandment of you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And what I really love about how this is all operating in the mitzvot, the system of mitzvot, which isn't just a matter of good deeds, but is actually a profound way to express a relationship with God, and for us to discover that this is also a profound way to express a relationship with other human beings as well. So let's go on now, Uveged Klilai, right? And clothing of mixtures. Lama ne'emar. So why is this stated? The fishe ne'emar. Why? Because elsewhere it says, Lo tilbash shatnes. It says, you shall not wear. And I'm just going to leave this word as untranslated for the moment, tzemer upishtim yachdav, because it says, you shall not wear, as let's just say right now that this is somehow means a blends of wool and flax together. So there's now going to be, you're going to get an example of the kind of analysis that the Talmud goes into in terms of understanding Jewish law, and of course, ultimately desiring to perform divine will in a very serious and rigorous kind of way. And in order to do that, to analyze these laws in the Torah as closely as one can and deconstruct them as much as possible. So we're getting a little taste of this, and the Talmud basically, for the most part, goes into incredible detail with regard to these things. So again, right? Attention to detail is another expression of love, right? When you love something, the details matter. Right. So anyway, so it says elsewhere, this wool and flax. Yachol, and we could understand by that, lo yilbash gizei tzemer, that a person should not wear wool shearings. Gizei tzemer are wool shearings. So it's not necessarily, here I don't believe we're talking about the actual material from which the wool is made, right? I think we're talking about simply the raw wool. The anitse pishtam would be flax combings. And again, this is raw flax essentially, or raw linen. So that's included, we might think that that's included in this mitzvah. Talmud Lomar, for this reason, in other words, that you can't put wool shearings and flax, combine them and put them on your body, right? So Talmud Lomar beged. And for the reason, that's why it says clothing. Minayin, okay, so on the one hand, it isn't just the raw flax or the raw wool. It has to be stuff that's made into clothing. Minayin lirabot halevadim. So what about felt, right? Because we know that felt isn't woven. That's the whole point about felt, right? Is that you just press the wool together, you put water on it or whatever, it shrinks, it clings. Wool is such that it has these little hooks, these almost microscopic little hooks in it, and it combines together. Talmud Lomar, and for this reason, it uses the word shatnez. So we know that if those wool shearings are pressed together, even though they're not woven into clothing, but they're felt clothes, right? So it says shatnez, davar shehu shua tavui venuz, something that is pressed together. It may be woven and it may be twisted. So the shua and the tavui venuz doesn't necessarily tell us about the levadim, but the shua does. The omer ani. So Rashi goes on to personally state news, that this word news is related lashon. It is derived from a word davar hanimlal, something that is stretched, v'shazur, and this is and twisted. Ze im ze, one in another, l'chavero, in order to connect it. So stretched and twisted to attach it, one piece to another. And he uses a French word, miste. However, that Lauren, you may have a better pronunciation than I have from the Hebrew here, but this would be the medieval French, and the Yiddish would be weben, a web, right? Web. And this is from Moed Katan, a tractate called Moed Katan, which he's going to quote here. And Moed Katan, which means small festival, refers to the intermediate days of the festival. In other words, that it's not a major festival like a Yom Tov, where various kinds of work are forbidden, like Shabbat. But on the other hand, there's certain ways in which the intermediate days of a festival are observed with certain kinds of labor forbidden. And the Moed Katan goes into a lot of detail as to what kind of work is permissible and what kind of work is forbidden on these intermediate days. So here we go. This is it. Komo chazian lenaze, right? We look upon sesame plants, right? Something like that. The it bahon, bahon, the it bahon. Sorry, we look at the fact that sesame plants have naazeh, and naazeh is the dried up seeds. So I put the whole translation of the phrase, looked it up, and found the whole translation here. That it's generally you're not allowed to harvest on intermediate days. Harvesting would be considered a forbidden labor. But in analyzing this very carefully, you can harvest sesame plants on the intermediate days of the festival. And again, because of the dried out seeds that they contain. And again, you're allowed to prepare food even on Yom Tov, right? Even though cooking is not permissible on Shabbat, it is permissible on Yom Tov for the meals that you have on Yom Tov. So taking it a notch down, right? Because the sesame plants have these naazeh, right? These edible seeds that when you harvest them, it's like, opening up a peanut or something like that. That since such plants have edible food immediately, you can harvest them. So, I mean, to understand this better, we would have to actually study Moed Katan. She'anu mefarshin, that we explain this, Lashon Kamush. We're talking about something that is pickled, in other words, withered. That's the word kamush. And kamushim refers to like pickles, and as opposed to drying food. So we're talking about the withering of it. So again, this twisted, pushed together, stretched, etc. And here's this French word, filistre, something like that. And verwekkelt means withered in Yiddish. Ulashon shatnez, he goes on again, because this word shatnez is such a strange word, right? Lashon shatnez, piresh Menachem, and he quotes another commentator that Rashi often refers to, that Menachem, this person Menachem, explains it as machberet tzemer upishtim. He says that the word shatnez refers specifically to a combination, machberet, a combination or a composition of wool and flax. So that's, at least that's what we've dealt with on this particular issue. So now we have these, here you have in the Torah, you probably have heard of shatnez, there's a good chance you've heard of it, and the prohibition of wearing clothing that's a mixture of wool and flax. This is not the only time it's mentioned in the Torah, it's mentioned elsewhere as well. And as I said, Rashi gives us some introduction. That's the nature of what we're doing with Rashi, is that Rashi is allowing us to go a little deeper into the text and as to how to interpret it. A new law would appear to be unrelated. But I think it also has to do with a combination of some kind that might not be considered appropriate. And the issue of boundaries is, of course, a very important primary issue, as we see from Genesis chapter 1, that the way in which to understand that there are boundaries in life and to observe those boundaries, and if you don't, it tends to be destructive. The ish ki ishkav et isha.
But by the way,
yeah.
Just a quick question before you move on to the next one.
Yes.
I'm not that familiar with clothing, but in modern days, in our times, are there any clothing still made of combinations of wool and flax? I mean, probably every.
Good question. So the story goes, as I understand it, that sometimes the padding in a suit, like the shoulder pads, are made out of linen in a wool suit. And so there are actually people within the Orthodox community who are experts in this particular subject. Believe it or not, I imagine at this point you believe it, that when it comes to almost any subject, again, this whole idea, right, of deconstruction is that developing expertise, takes a lot of study and stuff. And these are people who are able to, they will take their suits, their wool suits, to this individual, and they will examine it and remove any linen that might be found in the wool suit. Incident, yes,
Pearl Borrow,
yes,
of blessed memory.
yes.
She used to tell a story about shatnez. She
Yes.
went shopping and looking for a suit, and she
Yes.
found it was beautiful, great. It just felt delicious and whatever. And then she read the ingredient, she read the what was in the fabric, and yep, and it was linen and wool. Right. And she was so upset.
Right. And again, arbitrary, right? I mean, we can try to rationalize it. We can say, look, it's combining an animal product with a vegetable product, and that is crossing a boundary. But regardless, that's not the reason we do it. The reason we do it is it's commanded. That's a good enough reason.
Okay. No, I was just trying, because
sure.
a lot of yeah, thanks for the clarification, because most clothing, a lot of clothing also has synthetic blends in it, as
Exactly.
opposed to linen, and as opposed to flax and wool. So
Right.
that's I was just curious. Okay.
No, it's good. It's good. And it does not apply to synthetic fabrics. Okay.
Yeah, of course.
I don't believe it does. It's strictly flax and wool. So the issue would be cotton. I don't think cotton, whether cotton and wool would be forbidden, I'm not sure. This is where expertise has to come into play. All right. And by the way, I don't know how more recently cotton was discovered as a source of fabric. I think it's, we know about Egyptian cotton, so could be around for quite a long time. So specifically linen, and there may be other reasons, we don't know them. That's not the reason we observe this. So as far as I was going to mention that, however, when it comes to the talit, you can have a linen talit with wool tzitzis.
Really?
Yes, you can. And it has to do, it's an interpretation that was understood because it talks in, I think it's in Deuteronomy, where it says it's a very terse statement of the Shatnez rule, where it says, you shall not have garments of linen and flax, and you shall make fringes for your garments. So in other words, the connection in the one verse is basically saying, but you could make fringes for your garments, goes into the laws of talit making and whether you could make tzitzit out of wool for a linen garment, etc. So, it is. Again, part of that's, you can either see this as a painstaking and painful thing, or you can delight in the detail. You can find joy and actual deep, it's hard to explain, but it can feel, if you are into this, and if you if you're focused enough, you can find really tremendous pleasure in the detail and tremendous beauty. Certainly in the workings of the mind that go into this. Going on. So
thank you.
You bet. The ish ki ishkav et isha, and if a man lies with a woman, shichvat zera, meaning sowing seed, right? This is obviously a euphemistic way of talking about intercourse. Vehi shivcha necherefet, and she is a handmaid that is. Now, the word necherefet is not an easy word to translate. Rashi's going to comment on that. I looked it up and sensed that it means designated, the ish to a man. So we know from another case when we were reading in Mishpatim, I believe, we had talked about the case of a Hebrew slave and that he was allowed, his master could give him a Canaanite woman to bear children. And without going into all the complicated and emotionally laden details of that, just to understand a context. I'm not trying to go into a lot of detail over that right now. I'm just trying to give you a context. We also talked about a young woman. Remember the case where the family was incredibly poor, and it talked about the man taking, this young girl, and he can either, make her into a wife, ask her to marry him, etc., marry her, or have his son marry her, and that she needed to be treated like any wife. She had to be given all the same rights, remember? And there was talk about or redeeming her or setting her free, etc., etc. You may go back to Parshat Mishpatim. I believe that's where we read about it, etc. So we're making a reference to that right now. Going on. The hofde lo nifdata, and redeemed, she was not redeemed. Or chufsha, or set free. By the way, Onkelos is very helpful here. Her freedom, lo nitan la, was not given to her. So he talks about here, Onkelos goes a little bit further than simply translating. The it paraka, meaning redeemed, lo it parikat, she was not redeemed, bechaspa, with money. O cheruta would be freedom, la it yahivatla, she was not given bishtar, with a contract, with a document. So we'll see how Rashi reflects exactly that. This is a complicated law, but we'll do the best to do as much of it as we can. On the other hand, it is late, and I can try and do this tomorrow, start with this tomorrow. That may make more sense. Although, let me finish the sentence. Let me at least finish the sentence. And then we'll look at the Rashi tomorrow. Bikoret tihiyel tihiyeh, there shall be an investigation. The word bikoret, right? Levakir, to visit, right? We use it as a meaning to visit. But so investigation, when you visit, you go in to see someone. It's also a verb we use for criticism, right? So again, looking into something, and it might be suggesting that we shouldn't criticize unless we've examined something. So there needs to be an examination, an investigation. Lo yumtu, they shall not be put to death. Ki lo hu pasha, because she was not set free. So I imagine there are lots of questions that you might have about this, but we will try and go at them tomorrow. And I'm going to set our marking here. See what I can do here. There we go.
There's just too much to unpack in that sentence.
Oh, there is. So
It's a long sentence.
I know, it's long. Lots going on. I'm going to stop the share. And hopefully I've set things up in such a way that you're going to want to come back tomorrow to see if we can figure out what this is all about. And Rashi,
I have a question, Rabbi.
Yes, Harlan.
I have a question. Well, there is an exception on the rule for mixing the wool and linen.
Yes.
The priests were allowed to
Correct.
mix the wool and linen. Not you, but the priests.
Correct.
There was an exception.
Say that again.
And also about the slaves. All right, if I have a slave in the ancient days, and she was betrothed or she was engaged to another person, I could still have intercourse with that slave because she's not married yet to that person. That is wrong to me. I don't know why.
No, that's not what it said.
Excuse me, that's wrong, period. Harlan, it's not giving permission for that. Okay, the issue is whether it's a capital offense. We haven't, please, this is a work in progress. So hold off the questions. Wait until we've gotten through this entire subject. We've got another 2 sentences to deal with this particular subject. And at that point, you'll be able to ask your questions. Now, the fact that a priest, it doesn't mean that a priest could go out to a dinner party wearing a suit with woolen flax. It has to do with the fact that in serving God, the clothing of the high priest did contain combinations of this, which may be another reason for it being forbidden to a commoner, right? That in making those kinds of distinctions and creating those kinds of boundaries, it's essentially what is the issue? What is one of the primary issues involved in setting up boundaries? One word: respect. When you set boundaries, it is essentially demonstrating respect. So if you say, well, a priest is allowed to wear woolen flax, but I'm not allowed to wear woolen flax, it's a way of showing deep respect to God.
But we are allowed on our talit, which brings it up to that level. Yes. So, so that's where I like that idea.
Yes, it is, because it's also saying that when do you use a talit, right? To serve, essentially to underscore
during service
to God. I'm sorry we missed our minyan. We had a minyan for a second, and it would be wonderful if we could do a kind of
he had to leave.
Today, but if we can't, we can't. So I don't know. We still only have 9 people. So it is what it. I don't know if
Well,
Lee.
I have Melinda here.
Okay.
I
All
have
right.
Melinda
All
right
right.
here, my
But is
daughter.
everybody else comfortable about showing themselves? Oh, let me stop. I think we're still recording. So let me stop the recording.